So what does revelation mean exactly? Like, how does that work precisely, right? When people wrote the Bible, how did they write it? How do they know what to write? I remember when I was in college, like many people who became Christians or whatever, they had a conversion experience when they were young. And I had this great experience, and I started going to church for the first time. And people started throwing around all these different terms like blood of Christ, or forgiven for your sins, or praise God, or hallelujah, stuff like that. Stuff I never heard before. And they also use this phrase, word of God. And they would say things like, hey man, did you bring your word today? Don't forget your word. And what they meant was the Bible. Now I know I never really fully thought it through. But what I think what I was thinking when people said word of God, I think I just thought like the Bible was this almost like this book that was like emblazoned with gold, or maybe like a lightning bolt struck it, and then somehow like it just the words like magically appeared on this page, and then maybe it was raised out of a lake, or brought down, like I don't know, any number of fantastical scenes. Again, I didn't consciously think this, but I think I just thought it was some mystery as to how someone wrote all this shit down, you know what I mean? For a lot of people in the faith, when any faith almost, like when they think about their sacred books, I think they often have a vision that's somewhat cinematic, somewhat king, like Arthurian, the sword, this lady in the lake lifts the sword or something like that. I think it kind of has that vibe to it. And so that's what, in a weird way, that's what modern people think of. Like, we as modern people, we just think, oh, Revelation must be some really dramatic experience. Moses on the mountaintop, or the transfiguration of Jesus with the disciples. But what did ancient people think of as revelation? And did it differ from how we think of it as modern people? Or more accurately, what we think that they thought of as revelation? Now, obviously, we can't really go back and talk to them directly, but we do have some evidence of what they thought of as revelation. And that, of course, is the Bible. It's kind of this stable piece of literature or documentation that all of us can look at. And if we were to study how it was put together, then, like the how, right? How did it actually come together? Was it some woman in a lake, or was it some lightning bolt from the sky striking a mountain, whatever? If we knew exactly how it came together, or some sense, then we might get a sense of how the authors might have thought of as revelation. And what we might find is that the ancient experience of God and revelation, or divine inspiration, isn't necessarily so different from the modern experience of God. So, in order to help us frame this issue a little bit better, this idea of revelation, or at least our modern conception of revelation, let's take a look at a clip. It's a good old fashioned atheist versus religion debate, our favorite kind of debate between two really popular, important intellectual figures. The first one being Richard Dawkins of the more atheist camp, of course, and then the other one being Jordan Peterson of the more religious camp. And in this clip, what you're going to see is that they begin talking about the very nature of revelation. How does it work? What can we call revelation? And actually, this is a high point in their debate. I mean, they start talking about the usual things. Does God exist? Does God exist? Does he not? Is he material, or where's the proof? And it starts right. It starts there, but then it really comes to a head with this very issue that we're going to talk about. What exactly is revelation? How does it work? So take a look.
Richard asked you before about the difference between a story or an idea naturally evolving over the course of numerous manuscripts and throughout human history, and the idea of it being divinely inspired. And you were seeming to imply that these are almost interchangeable concepts. Now, if that's the case, when you say that this divine spirit behind the Bible is actually just the way that it has evolved throughout the human history, throughout the different manuscripts that we've had, then saying that that is what divinity is, I think for you may drag the mundane up into the realm of divinity. But I think for people like Richard, and for many people listening, what it does instead is drags the divine
Yes,
down to the realm of the mundane.
very well put, yes. I don't think it doesn't make any difference to me whether it's the material reaching upward or the divine descending downward. I don't think there's any difference between those two
Well, you
things.
don't. That's exactly right. That's the problem.
Right, so Dawkins getting a little feisty there, but wasn't it so great how they framed the issue? What actually is revelation? And isn't it kind of funny how the tables turned a little bit? There's Dawkins, the atheist, insisting that revelation has to be something special, something outside of our ordinary experience. He seems to be holding the more traditional, modern conception of what we think of as revelation, as something that's, right, unusual or extraordinary. Whereas Peterson, the more religious guy, is saying, no, revelation can be actually mundane. He's saying it doesn't matter how, if we say it has to come up or come down, it actually is this very recognizable process. And isn't that really the crux of all religious atheist debates? Right? It's always atheists saying, hey man, show me the proof. You have no proof. It's all subjective. And you have the religious person saying, no, you got to open your heart, or I had this experience, this encounter, and it wasn't, it wasn't anything ordinary. It didn't just come from me, it came from above or whatever. It's like he's trying to prove this miracle. And that is the debate. And it really comes down to, like, what is revelation? How do we know it's from God? So shortly after this clip, the debate takes kind of an unexpected turn. So take a look.
I'm very interested in the possibility that truths emerge through evolving manuscripts. Now, that's a very interesting idea, and it's totally different from divine inspiration. And I want to pursue it because I don't believe in divine inspiration, but I would be prepared to believe in evolving manuscripts.
Isn't that interesting? Like, Dawkins almost seems to come around, or at least there seems to be a bridge now between the two. And he's saying, like, I totally relate to what he's saying, because he's going, look, I don't care for this idea of revelation, where, like, your only source, like, I should listen to you because you have some cool story that I can't corroborate. I can't verify it. I can't even really argue with you. I just have to take your word for it, and then now I have to change my life. Now I have to listen or follow all these different rules, or make all these sacrifices, turn my whole life around just because you have a really cool story. That's basically his argument. So I completely understand where he's coming from. But then also I really love how he says, look, if you're telling me that these documents came about through successive manuscripts, that these ideas evolved over time, over thousands of years, and the strongest ideas survived, okay, now I'm game. Now I want to listen. Now you have a story that I can relate to, that I can corroborate. I mean, here's the Bible. It did survive this many thousands of years. So what that would mean, like, if that were true, if the Bible came about as a result of many successive manuscripts changing over time, evolving over time, is that the ancient conception of revelation would probably be a lot different than what we think of it, or what we think that they thought of it as, right? It wasn't just a voice out of the sky. It was the way culture evolves, the way we see it evolving now, just intuition, this strange gestalt of crowds, I guess, electing one song over another, one book over another, one phrase or meme over another. We don't really know why. Some things make us laugh, some things don't. That instinctual creativity that we recognize today, maybe that's what they thought of as the voice of God. And so what that would mean if that was the way it came about, and therefore that is the way the ancients saw revelation, as basically a contest of ideas, to me, then we have something to talk about. Because it's not just top down, here's the story and you have to like it and don't argue with it. That's not how the Bible came about, right? If we're going with this theory, the Bible came about as a result of the clash of ideas having to hold their own in the marketplace. And people voted with their interest, or like with their actions, what ideas they followed, or what they lifted up, right? What they elevated. And that'll be very interesting, because now anyone can get involved in that kind of debate. You don't even have to label yourself a Christian or a religious person. You can just look at the idea, look at the principles of the idea, and say, hey, I like it or I don't like it. Hey, this idea needs to be updated. If we want to apply this idea to ourselves now, this is how we should understand it. And so, in some sense, I mean, we should be, and we are, according to the ancients, again, if the Bible came about that way, that according to the ancients, we are still writing scripture. We're still writing sacred documents. But we're getting, a little ahead of ourselves. Like the first question that we need to answer is it even true, right? Can we verify? Is there some sense of how the Bible actually came together? Was it just top down, I had a cool story and you have to listen to it and I brainwash you into liking it or something like that? Is that how it happened, is there some evidence that it happens somewhat more, like, let's say, organically, a process that we would recognize today? And if we can establish that there is some good evidence of that, okay, then what does that mean exactly? Can we call that divine? What does that even mean anymore? So we have two great tasks on our hands. We need to answer the first question of how did the Bible come about? What evidence do we see of how it came about? And the second question is, what does that even mean? Right? So, all right, well, let's get started. So in order to answer the question of how the Bible might have come together, like what were the mechanisms? What was the exact methodology for getting those words on the page? So it's not so much of an archaeological, what were the tablets, can we trace the ancient parchments? It's more like, what were the forces that allowed this book to come into being? So the first expert we're going to turn to is an Assyriologist. And you might ask, well, why an Assyriologist? Well, an Assyriologist technically is someone who specializes in cultures that use cuneiform. And that would mean cultures originating in ancient Mesopotamia, anywhere from around the time of Christ all the way back to even, say, 8000 BC. And the reason for this is because this is the area of the world and the time period during which the Bible was created. And so if you're trying to answer the question of how the Bible might have come together, well, you could say, I mean, how did other pieces of literature from this area and this time period, how did those pieces come together? Or in particular, how did other religious epics come together? Because there were a few written during that time. So meet Stephanie Daly, our expert Assyriologist. She is a retired professor from Oxford, very well decorated. In particular, she wrote a book called Myths from Mesopotamia, a book that I've reviewed, and it's part of the Oxford World's Classics, so pretty prestigious list. She in it she translates a number of epics, so that would include Gilgamesh, of course, the Enuma Elish, which is the Sumerian creation epic, and then the Atrahasis, which is the Babylonian flood account. So among a number of others, but those are kind of the main ones that you've probably heard of. And you can sort of scroll down here. So it's just a quick Google search. She's an honorary senior research fellow, and that's a title that's only awarded to people that have contributed greatly to a particular field of study. So in this case, of course, Assyriology. So Oxford obviously has a pretty high esteem with this professor. And this is, as far as I know, this translation is considered one of the most authoritative translations. One of the more recent ones, 2008, is the most revised edition that I know of. And so we'll lean on some of her knowledge. So here I just want to touch on some of her notes in her lead up to Gilgamesh, the one that she translated in this book. And usually she includes some kind of introduction before each translation. And she talks about all sorts of cool stuff. Things like the source documents, the exact tablets that they use, the condition of the tablets, the problems they ran into. But she includes some really interesting notes on Gilgamesh in particular. And the reason why that's important is because Gilgamesh is an ancient religious epic. And so if we can have a sense of how Gilgamesh came about, we might be able to draw some conclusions or have some theories about how the Bible might have come about. So let's go through some of her notes. Now, Gilgamesh is interesting because what they found is that Gilgamesh was actually created from several short stories. So it's this long epic, but it's almost like Lego pieces, like numerous stories were strung together and then woven into a single narrative. And she was saying that most of the tales, they were very short. They were all written in Sumerian. And she says some of them show the background influence of contest literature. And this is really interesting. So I guess back in the day, they would have these royal courts, and they would have these storytelling contests. And it was a little bit like an Iron Chef kind of thing, where they had a hidden, like a secret theme, a special theme that everyone had to tell a story about. So she gives some examples. It could be like, she says what the merits of two deities, two people, animals, metals. It could be origin stories or stories explaining why things are, and just anything that we can learn about whatever that special topic was, and they would actually vote on who told the best stories, and then presumably like those are the stories that would get elevated. And so what is that? It's kind of like successive manuscripts, right? It's stories that are evolving over time. And these stories are so prominent that she says you can even find examples that persist through the Arabian Nights, which is really interesting. I mean, that was put together, I think, in the 1900s. So we're kind of seeing two different things happening here. Like, on the one hand, we're seeing the themes in Gilgamesh already being found in older documents, so older short stories, and then plugged into the larger epic. And the second thing is the fact, yeah, like they were plugged in, and this is the idea of redaction. So redaction is when you, let's say you have an original document and then you alter it in some way. In this case, they would alter these existing short stories from different cultures, again, Sumeria versus Babylon, and alter it in such a way that it formed a single epic story. And she's saying that this was an art form, essentially. She says, with considerable skill, considerable changes out of diverse elements. They shave off a few corners here and there, add a few elements there, and now it's a single story. So once again, Gilgamesh, this religious epic, was shown to be created out of pre-existing stories. And in fact, even these stories had pre-existing elements, like the contest literature, that stories evolving out of stories, out of stories. You can even kind of see this now with like how they keep remaking movies like Charlie's Angels or Star Trek. We keep retelling the same story, and then history will show which stories were the best, right? Which ones will persist. But yeah, so we're seeing evidence of this successive manuscripts inside this particular religious epic. And then not only that, but it was actually a bit of an art form of how to weave these stories into a larger epic. And so it kind of makes you wonder, like, maybe some of the short stories came from other even shorter stories, or so you can't really trace necessarily who did what. And I think it's something that we're not used to, right? We're always used to, I guess, as capitalists, as modern people, we just want to know who did stuff. We want to put our stamp on it and get paid $1 million and win all this fame and fortune. But that's not really how they thought back then, I guess. Like, there's no strong sense of authorship. What they wanted was just the best story. So she goes through and gives some examples of key parts of Gilgamesh, definitely coming from some other culture or some other story. And so we'll just highlight a couple of these. So the first one is the death of Gilgamesh. And this is the part where Gilgamesh desperately seeks immortality because his friend dies, Enkidu. And she's saying this type of quest, or the themes in this story in particular, was already found in another Sumerian story. And so the academic consensus is that this part of Gilgamesh was certainly based on this other Sumerian short story. And she says it was, but this Sumerian story was given a new and larger setting, so they made it bigger and better, essentially. And then she goes on to say that another very famous part of Gilgamesh, we all seem to know this story, the flood, yeah, that almost for sure had no original connection with the original Babylonian version of Gilgamesh. It had no connection with Uruk, no connection with Gilgamesh, right? And so that story was also woven in. So what we're starting to see is that storytelling and then story retelling and taking apart and putting back together and borrowing from what Dowley says, many diverse elements, weaving into a single narrative. We're seeing that with religious epics that came out of that same area and the same time period as the Bible. And so this idea of successive manuscripts evolving over time, and even redaction and mixing and matching manuscripts, that seems to be the case, that that's how religious epics were written. And so the next question would be then, well, if that's how that was written, do we see evidence of that in the Bible? And if that's the case, then maybe successive manuscripts, storytelling and retelling, and redaction, maybe that's the voice of God. All right, so we've seen how religious works emerge, or big religious epics emerged, in that same part of the world, ancient Mesopotamia, that produced the Bible. It's roughly the same time period. We do know that Babylon preceded Hebrew culture. Akkadian, the language of Babylon, was actually the first Semitic language, and then that led to other types of Semitic languages, such as Hebrew and Arabic. And so the main question now is like, if that's how religious epics were produced, basically in that same part of the world, same time period, is that also how the Bible came about? Did it use those same types of mechanisms? Namely, the successive manuscripts, right? The kind of like an evolving storytelling. Someone tells a story, they tell it a little bit better, or it's a little more popular, or that catches on, someone retells it and retells it. So do you see that kind of story or manuscript evolution? And then you also see evidence of redaction, and that's taking existing stories, chopping them up, putting them back together, elongating some, shortening others, weaving multiple stories into an epic. So that's redaction. Are those two forces at work in the Bible? Can we see evidence of that? Or was it just sort of like a top-down voice from heaven, one guy writing it down, and it just came out the way it is? All right, so why don't we take a look at that? And once again, we're going to lean on some experts. All right, so meet Christine Hayes, looking at her picture here. She is a Sterling professor at Yale. Religious studies, Sterling, I learned, is the highest title that you can get at Yale, only reserved for their most accomplished, most well-respected professors, so doing a great job there. But I will say that I have seen her lectures online. She's got them all there, and the best way I can describe it, she speaks softly, but she roars like a lion. Her stuff blew my hair back, I'm not gonna lie. I read her book, Introduction to the Bible, reading through it actually, but it's amazing. Don't read it sitting down. Don't read it if you're easily offended. She just lays it out how it is. I can't tell you how many times I was just shaking my head reading this book, just being like, man, the stones on this woman, you know what I mean? Like, she just calls it out. But she has a great blend of academic analysis and, from what I can tell, a very religious mindset. Like, I think she is very, at the very least, respectful of that tradition. I would guess that she practices, just based on, I don't know, just the vibe that I get. But she definitely, she gets into the academic side, and so we're going to kind of lean on her work, use her as a guide as we explore how the words of the Bible might have gotten onto the page, essentially. So, all right, let's take a look. Okay, so once again, we're looking for this idea of successive manuscripts. Do we see this type of evolution happening in the Bible? Is there evidence of this somehow? And what we're going to do, we're going to compare two different stories, two different creation stories. And one of them preceded the Bible, and then we'll have the Bible story. So we'll see if we can see any kind of relationship, maybe a progression, or was the Bible based upon this story? So the control, or whatever, the older story is going to be the Enuma Elish. And as we know, Babylon was the very first Semitic language, Semitic society. And so, yeah, they have the older creation story, the Enuma Elish. You may have heard of it. And then we're going to compare that to 7 days of creation in Genesis, or Bereshit. So let's take a look. So we are going to be using the Dali translation, Ms. from Mesopotamia. And the first thing you might notice is that these two stories are named in the exact same way. So Enuma Elish, when skies above, you go to the first line of the text. When skies above, right? So pretty straightforward naming pattern. And then if you go over here to Genesis, so Bereshit, the very first word is actually Bereshit. And we can go over to this awesome website called Sefaria. It has to be the best Hebrew Torah Tanakh site ever. They've linked like 10,000 documents to this. But anyways, take a look at the Hebrew. I love this ancient Hebrew. I think it looks so cool. Bereshit. Okay, and that's the name of the book, Bereshit, and it is translated as when. Now, this word when I think does actually make sense. Most Bibles, or a lot of Bibles, especially the Christian Bibles, they use the term in the beginning. And I think maybe ironically, if that's the right word, this is kind of like evidence of successive manuscripts, right? We're using our intuition to try to tell a better story. And what better beginning is there than an epic book like the Bible, than in the beginning, Charlton Heston's voice. But actually, when you think about it, if you read the text, in the beginning doesn't quite make sense because it's not totally the beginning. In the Enuma Elish, when skies above were not yet named, so there were skies, there was earth, right? Not pronounced by name. Something was there, and there were these primordial beings. If you go to the Bereshit story, when God, we're going to get to this in a second, began to create, the earth was unformed, darkness over the deep. Now, there was stuff there already. So it wasn't quite in the beginning. I think there was, unless that was also there in the beginning. So anyways, I think when God began to create does make sense. It makes a little more sense because there was already stuff there. Now, in addition, this word God, let's take a look at the Hebrew, Elohim, Elohim. And this this usually means, it doesn't mean see, that's yam. Usually means plural. So you could have esrim. Now, esrim means 20. Eser means 10. So sometimes means twice, like machanayim versus machane. And machanayim is translated as two camps. But anyways, it generally is plural. And so it's Bereshit bara, which is create, Elohim, gods. Technically, this should have an S, when gods began to create. And academic people say this is something called a fossilization because the Hebrew culture almost certainly came from an older polytheistic culture. Their word for God, this name for God, still said gods. Now, I think they intentionally kept this fossil in here, this remnant from that older culture. They felt like that is the essence of God, I guess. But, when they refer to him, they still say he, they don't say them. So it's kind of this weird duality where it's Elohim, gods, but he's still referred to as he. His pronoun is he, okay? He's not they. His pronoun is... Okay, sorry. So, Bereshit, bara, Elohim, these stories are starting out in the same way. The setting is the same. We have primordial beings and some unformed mass. Same exact settings, same exact naming schemes, same exact first line, essentially. And we get to a linguistic parallel, which is exciting. Apsu is the first. Apshu, I think, is the first one. He's the freshwater masculine being. And then we have Maker Tiamat. Tiamat, as you probably know, if you're probably a big, like ancient history, religious nerd if you're listening to this, but Tiamat is the big, watery, chaotic sea monster, feminine sea monster. And that's actually accurate. It's derived from the word tamtum, which is the Akkadian word for sea. And so that's sort of Christine Hayes kind of drops this knowledge. We're leaning on her scholarship. But so Tiamat, saltwatery monster. And on the other side, we have this word tehom, the surface of deep. Now, this is Hayes' translation. If we go over to the JPS, one that I like, it says, with darkness over the surface of the deep. Okay? Now, the deep. Now, Hebrew does have definite articles like the. It's ha, veha'aretz, right? The earth, veha'aretz. But this is tehom here. Tehom, you can kind of look. This nice interactive text, deep, depth, sea. There's no ha. If it was a definite article, it would say ha tehom. So that's why she believes that they're treating this like a name. Tehom is like a proper noun. It's a thing on its own. And it's sort of watery. Like it has this watery thing going on about it. So we have two different terms here, Tiamat, Tehom. Now, Tehom is the masculine form. If we were to feminize it, it's Tehoma. So Tehoma, Tiamat, She's making the case these words are etymologically identical. I don't think anyone really argues that. And it's being treated as a proper noun. So Tiamat is kind of in this story, but they masculinized it and they made it sort of kind of inanimate. So we're seeing some parallels between these two stories, but there are some very key differences. Here we have two different gods. Here we kind of have a singular multiplicity, I guess you could say. We have these unformed things that are there, and then we have this salt watery mass, and on the one hand it's animated, on the other hand it doesn't seem overly animated. So, okay, so that's a start. And now we get to the crux of the story, at least in the Babylonian version. And what they're saying, like the Apsu and Tiamat, they have kids, and their kids are really noisy. It seems kind of a silly story, but I don't want to make light of it because it probably was a very serious story. But their kids are making too much noise, and they can't rest. By day I cannot rest, by night I cannot sleep. Let peace prevail so that we can sleep. And they actually plan to murder their kids because they're like, we got to rest. So this resting, this idea of sleep, rest, getting rest, this is the impetus. This is the plot driver of this Babylonian creation story. And if we look over to 7 days of creation, many of you probably know what happened on the seventh day. It's, I think, one of the more unusual climatic events in any creation story that I think I've ever read, or ancient creation story, and that is on this climatic seventh day, what does he do? Does he celebrate in the heavens? Does he I don't know, create like a huge explosion? Like, I don't know. What he does is he rests. He rested on the seventh day. And this becomes a absolutely critical, central pillar, main pillar of the Judaic religion. This is sort of like the climax of creation. So rest is driving the story in the Babylonian version, and rest is the culmination in the Judaic story. So we're seeing narrative parallels here. So that's pretty interesting. We go on to learn that one of their kids, Anu, so at this point Apshu has been murdered by the kids, and now they now live in his body. Very symbolic. And he creates the four winds because Tiamat is still there. Everyone's afraid of her. She is like the final boss. And he makes these winds, and he drives the winds into the waters. We all know what happens during a storm: huge swells, tidal waves, turmoil, churning. And Tiamat, she's made of water. She's heaving restlessly day and night. And what happens? She just can't rest. She can't sleep. All the gods can't rest, actually, because I guess she's so pervasive that it just disturbs all the heavens. So resting is still this problem, and here are these winds that become significant in the story. We cross over to Bereshit, and yes, there is in fact a wind sweeping over the waters. It is translated as, usually it's translated as the Spirit, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. That's a typical Christian translation. It's not totally off, of course, but ruach, I think the more appropriate translation for this word here, ruach, see it says here, it can be a smell, it can be a waft, a breath, a spirit, a mind, a wind, different ways. I have seen it used to describe an aroma, so ruach, and it's ruach Elohim, so the wind of Elohim, the wind from God, essentially. And it's what is it doing? It's sweeping over the waters. Now this word for sweep, oh, why am I highlighting that? Highlighting this, here we go. Rachaf, right? First it says soft, so there's a softness to it, hovering. I've heard it used, or I've read it being used to describe an eagle gliding down to her nest. You know, it's a very gentle image. It's not this storm, cyclone, chaotic wind just creating all this upheaval. No, it's this gentle wind. It's this spirit wind, whatever, ruach Elohim, just gently hovering over the waters. Very serene, very kind of meditative. And the whole Bereshit story, the creation story, has this meditative feel to it. It's very satisfying to read. It kind of like it kind of settles you, you know, like well, however you feel about, like the story, it's just it's kind of a very peaceful story, and the by contrast you have all this turmoil and upheaval. I mean, someone's already been murdered at this point. So there's another similarity. We have waters, we have primordial beings, we have this wind now, we have rest and sleep, we have conflict in one, we have no conflict in the other. So there's some differences here. Here we come to a big battle. And this is the ultimate battle. This is for all the marbles. They're battling Tiamat. Marduk is the only one willing to step up, and he comes with this wind. He drives it into her. She opens the mouth. She swallows it. He pulls out a spear, I believe, or an arrow, and splits her open and cuts her down the middle and pierces her heart, and she dies. And if we go over to the Bereshit story, what do we have? I got nothing. There's no battle. No one dies. No one's getting stabbed. No one's getting wind driven into them. No one's getting split open. There's nothing. No one's losing sleep. Like this, they're just such different stories, but you can see, or I like to think that you can sort of see, like, there is definitely some parallels here, right? This is, in my mind, this is a storytelling contest, right? This looks like evolving manuscripts to me, but with some very, very key differences. So, yeah, so he splits her in two. He takes her carcass, and half of her he put up to roof the sky. So he separates her. He separates Tima. He separates what? The waters. Okay? And if we go over to Bereshit, what does God do? He's separating water from water. The waters above from the waters below. The heavens and then the seas on the earth. So, kind of similar. He also takes the stars, arranges them, and he marks out time, essentially. He creates this measuring context or framework for time. And actually, in a climactic moment, one of the climactic moments is day 4, and that's because there's this chiastic relationship in the 7 days. But we digress. But at the height of this chiastic mirroring, what you see is they shall serve as signs for set times, moed, which is sacred time, set time. So similar things are happening here. And these happen in other creation stories, but they do happen in both. And then we get to the creation of man. And here we come to a crux of the story where we can really see, how the messages of these stories differ quite a bit. This one says, let me put blood together, make bones, right? Set up primeval man. Man shall be his name, right? Let me create him. Why? Why create man? What's the purpose? Why did they do it? What do you think? What was the whole point of the story? They can't find rest. The work of the gods shall be imposed on him, so they, the gods, shall be at leisure. They can finally be at rest. And just down here, they did create him from the blood of a god, Chingu. They murdered Chingu. They murdered him, and then they use his blood, and they mix that blood together. So he is created from a god, man is. Well, he is created for servitude. For servanthood, let's call it what it is, slavery. I mean, that's kind of what it looks like here. So the gods can kick up their feet and relax, man. They don't have to put all this work in. It's way too much work, right? Again, I don't want to be too light about that this was probably how they established their society, how they established control and preserved their society, because it just sounds like a despotic agrarian society. That's what it sounds like. Now, if you cross over to Bereshit, they have a very different picture of why man was created. And God said, he just speaks, right? There's no war, there's no violence here. God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, right? And of course, it's male and female. He created them, right? They shall rule the whole earth. A little different than slavery. Why? Because God rules, and what happens? God rests on the 7th day, and we're all supposed to rest on that 7th day. And then, it makes you think of Exodus, right? what's the story of the Israelites? They escaped enslavement. They were slaves. If you think about, like, if this is a storytelling contest, right? And you have this culture that's born out of slavery, maybe by the Babylonians. I don't know. I don't know the exact history, but it seems like slavery is a key theme in the story. Probably that's in their experience. You know, like, you have this story that you inherited, right? About how you were born to be a slave. At at some point, they're gonna be like, you know what, like, fuck this story, because I'm just like, I'm tired of getting kicked in the face and beaten and murdered for not working hard enough while these guys take up their. It's like, no, that's not the right story, and so now they start telling this other story, and this is a story that prevails in this Israelite culture. So to me, it seems to jive on multiple levels. Like, if this was a culture born on the bottom end of of that of this Enuma Elish, right? This you were born for slavery story. You can kind of see how, if anyone was going to try to upset this story, it was probably the people on the bottom, right? The people on the top were like, "This is a great, I love this story," but and if they had a history of slavery, that they were enslaved, then it would make sense that they would try to tell like a different story, you know. And they did. It looks like they did. They accomplished it. The story still it's a very enduring story. And so, just to review, like, very similar beginnings, similar naming schemes. We have a linguistic parallel here. We have narrative parallels. The main plot of the story, it's about rest. It's about who can sleep, who can be at leisure here, and who has to work, and who, it has these very political concepts laid in them. You have governmental, societal structure being told within these stories, created within these stories, and they're just telling completely different stories. That, yeah, rest is something about, there's something sacred about leisure, that you're not just driven to work. There's something sacred about that both stories seem to recognize, and it's highly coveted. It is like it's this glimmering jewel that if you can have this thing, like, that that is a central part of the entire narrative. And we have this concept of wind, right? And they kind of reformat the wind. It's not this violent wind. It's just this kind of sovereign, mysterious, creative force that sweeps over the waters and then just gently or majestically parts them. And it's just a completely different story, right? There's no battle. There's no violence. It's just a single, sovereign, singular multiplicity, I guess, that acts as one, that creates and divides and marks out calendars, right? And then, just before the main culmination, the seventh day, they create man. And what is man for? Man is a slave, or man is a ruler, right? That we're all made to have this, I guess, a sense of majesty, or that we are all royal in blood, or it's a very attractive story. It's kind of it's not that different from the American story, like, all men are created equal and we all have the right to pursue and to have dominion over our lives, and to own and to have our own little kingdoms, essentially. I mean, so yeah, there we go. To me, this speaks of successive manuscripts, and it makes sense that they would tell a story like this. So it seems to connect on multiple levels. All right, why don't we take a look at another ancient story? This one, the most famous ancient story that we probably have, the flood narrative. Do we see that same creative process at work? The successive manuscripts, the evolving storytelling. And this story, people like to bring this up as sort of like the gotcha for the Bible. Like, yeah, well, that flood story in the Bible, I mean, that they weren't the first ones to do that. Multiple cultures have told flood stories, and they sort of go on and on. And it's like, well, I mean, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, is it true? Is there a a derivative aspect to that story, like again, the successive manuscripts? Is there like a storytelling contest aspect to it? So let's take a look. So once again, we're going to be leaning on the scholarship of Stephanie Dalley in Ms. from Mesopotamia. And I'm just going to reference some of her notes because she does such a great job of kind of like giving context. Now, the interesting thing about the flood narrative is that it appears twice. Like, two of them appear inside the Babylonian tradition, the first one being inside Gilgamesh, and the second one being in Atrahasis. What's cool is that those two epics are separated by about 1,000 years. Gilgamesh far older, 3 to 4,000 BC. 3 to 4,000, am I doing that right? Always 4 to 3,000 BC, and then the Atrahasis, roughly 2 to 1,000 BC. And so there is this element of like the evolving manuscripts, the storytelling contests. She says regarding Gilgamesh that it was very likely, the flood narrative was very likely an independent tale in Sumerian. And so remember that most of the chapters in Gilgamesh have been traced back to standalone stories in Sumerian. And so they write redaction, they took these stories and wove it together, and the flood narrative is no different. It is just that. She says that it was incorporated maybe more effectively into Atrahasis, and it had kind of a different bent to it. So in the Atrahasis, the meaning of the flood was to reduce the population. Sort of an anticlimactic lesson of the flood, I guess. But part of that could be the ancient perspective was a bit different. So let's take a look quickly at just a couple excerpts from the Atrahasis to see why this version of the flood story seemed to rise to the top. Like, this was the story that went out, that it was there to reduce population. So here we see one of the gods, Elil, complaining that sleep cannot overtake me because of their racket, the humans. So this is sort of echoing the Enuma Elish with the concept of rest. And as a consequence, he's saying, cut off food from the people. We got to get rid of them. We got to like reduce their number. Let the field decrease its yield. Let Nisaba turn away her breast. Let earth clamp down her teats. I don't know. I just love this imagery. It's just it's so poetic and ancient. And so that nothing grows. So this is the idea of a famine. And famine was a real issue back then. We see it in many of the biblical accounts. And it's just hard for us to conceptualize that. I guess maybe if you're in the developed parts of the world, it's just not a thing anymore. But here's a description of the famine in the 5th year of the famine. Right, a daughter would eye her mother coming in, eye her sort of opportunistically, hungrily, in a perverse way. A mother would not even open her door to her daughter. A daughter would watch the scales at the sale of her mother. Mother would sell daughter. When the 6th year arrived, they served up a daughter for a meal, served up a son for food. So just a horrifying reality, one that many of us cannot even relate to. And so, yeah, if this is a reality of the world, then in some sense, of course it would make sense that that a story like this, that the flood was there to depopulate, that would come up because it just caused so many horrors, and they just thought, well, the problem isn't the food, the problem is there's too many people. So it meant something to them back then, although now it does seem a little bit like I don't know, it just seems kind of like, okay, whatever, we just can't relate, or many of us can't relate. And then just at the bottom here, just before we jump into the comparison, since we are going to get into Genesis, the Bereshit, Dalley comments sort of briefly that the dove so Noah sends out a dove to see if the waters have receded, and the dove brings back an olive leaf as a symbol that there is dry land. And she says that the olive leaf, actually, there were no olive trees in that geographic area where Noah was said to have emerged out of the flood. She's saying it's the floor of Palestine. Olive trees don't grow in Mesopotamia. So a little bit of setup evidence, just some color, flavor texting to set up our comparison for Bereshit versus the Babylonian flood narratives. So, all right, let's take a look. Okay, so we're going to go through our same exercise of looking at these two narratives side by side. We have the flood narrative from Gilgamesh, so the older account, and then comparing it to the one in Bereshit, Noach. There's not an explicit focused upon reason for the flood that they give in the Gilgamesh version. Like, there's no sort of like soliloquy by some god saying why they're doing it, but they do hint at it. So just before the episode happens, we have this poetic passage. Sometimes we build a house, sometimes we make a nest, but then brothers divide it upon inheritance. So we save up all this money, or not money, but save up all of our resources and have this great land, and then what happens? Your children just fight over it. And then it says, sometimes there is hostility in the land, but then the river rises and brings flood water. So here we're seeing this connection between people's behavior and then this catastrophic event. People behaving horribly, killing each other, hurting each other, and then what happens? The land kind of rebels, or the gods rebel. The flood comes and wipes everyone out. And then, of course, we see echoes of that in the Bereshit. So God said to Noah, I've decided to put an end to all flesh. Ketz kol basar, end to all flesh. And then, for the earth is filled with lawlessness because of them. And what it says is because of Hamas. And Hamas is like cruelty and violence between brothers, essentially. And then he says, I am about to destroy them. So we're kind of seeing echoes here. So far, some similarities. And then it gets like, there's many points of connection here. So, man of Shurupak, dismantle your house, build a boat. And Bereshit, make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms. Put aboard the seed of all living things into the boat, and of all that lives, of all flesh, right? Take two of each, the fun children's story version of Noah, 2 by 2, they enter the boat. So very, very similar, really interesting. The boat you are to build, these are her dimensions. This is how you make it, the length, the width, the height. 3 sar of pitch, even the material's the same, the pitch is the same. And here we'll take a moment to look at this word pitch. So this is kind of what happens when you just nerd out and obsess over these texts. You start noticing these things. This idea of pitch. It's actually kind of this very cultural word, I guess for both cultures, because on page, or a little bit before page 107, so a few pages before, Gilgamesh says this, let her door be bolted against grief with pitch and bitumen. Let her door be bolted against grief with pitch. So like he's talking about this woman that he spoke to, that he's sort of afraid that he might have grieved her in some way, and he uses this metaphor. In the same way that you use pitch to insulate your boat from the water, I hope she uses pitch to insulate herself from whatever I did to cause her grief. And this idea of pitch as a metaphor actually echoes itself. You caught me watching Charlie Kirk. I hope you're still watching this video. But it echoes itself in the Torah. And you see it in the definition. So this is Sefaria. Again, has to be the best Torah Tanakh site ever. And you have this live interactive text. And you can highlight this word for pitch, which is right here. And it's kofer. So kofer, right, it means pitch, but it also means the price of a life, or a ransom for a life. So it's a way to save a life. It has kind of this insulatory, protective, metaphorical meaning to it. And I think it comes from the power of these stories, these cultural stories. Even this idea of cover, right? This is vechafarta, or vechafareta. And that's this word kafar, and that's to cover, but it also means to make atonement, to purge. And that's using like a forgiveness, which is really a judgment kind of language. And as we know, just from reviewing this, that the flood came because of some kind of judgment, or at least that's what's hinted at in Gilgamesh, and then explicitly stated in Bereshit. So even this idea of pitch and using it as a cultural metaphor seems to be consistent between these two stories, that they seem to be derived from these two flood stories. So there's a lot of, at that level of detail, you're still seeing some derivative, like, similarities. if I can say it that way. So anyways, moving right along. We have similar time frames, 6 days and 7 nights, right? The waters came, and in this, on the 7th day, the waters came. So it's a little bit different, but you're still seeing this numerology. Here we come to an important difference. In Gilgamesh, the Gilgamesh account, the gods cowered like dogs. They crouch by an outside wall. Ishtar screamed like a woman giving birth. They're terrified. They start screaming too, like just in terror and fear. They don't know what's going on. They're freaking out. And then in the Genesis version, nothing. No one's crying out. No one's suffering. No one's confused, at least in the heavens. And this is sort of the difference of polytheism versus monotheism, where again, it's not the difference in poly and mono, it's not in the number of gods. Because remember, in both accounts, we still have gods plural. Elohim is plural. He still goes by the pronoun he, as I kind of joked, but like he is a multiplicity. The difference really between polytheism and monotheism is that in polytheism, the gods don't know, like they don't know everything. They're not in control of fate, time, and history. And in monotheism, Elohim, that multiplicity, is in control, and they are basically of one mind. There's no inner conflict. No one's tricking someone else. No one can thwart someone else. And so that's a big difference in these two stories. Again, they're similar, but they have key differences. And that's this evolving storytelling aspect. So moving right along, the boat had come to rest on Nimush. The ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. Utnapishtim, he releases a dove. Noach, he releases a dove. And here we get to another polytheism, monotheism difference with some fossilization. So, and I made a sacrifice. The gods smelt the pleasant sacrifice, and they gathered over it like flies. So, basically, in both flood narratives, the gods begin to starve. They enter this starvation mode, and it's graphic. Like they describe their lips are covered over with scabs, and discharge starts coming out of their mouth. Gods, like, it's kind of a frightening narrative to read. And when Utnapishtim finally comes out of the boat and makes a sacrifice, because remember, the gods, like, they need humans to do their work because they're used to resting. They swarm over it like flies. Like, it's kind of gross. So just very different imagery of the gods. And then over here, what happens? The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, but they don't show him eating. So Elohim, the gods, smell it, but then the story changes. So this is another example of a fossilization. Just like Elohim is a fossilization, kind of like a polytheistic remnant. For whatever reason, the Hebrew storytellers kept this part of the story, the pleasing aroma, but they changed its meaning. It's pleasing for some other reason, I guess because Noah gave honors to God, perhaps. And in fact, in other parts of the Bible, it goes out of its way to say that God doesn't need your sacrifice. He's not fed by them. He doesn't need you to feed him. So it's kind of this radical departure from the old way of thinking, the old conception of the world, the polytheism. The gods need you. They need your material. They're not totally in control. So again, it's very interesting differences. Here's another interesting similarity. Behold, O God, so this is Ishtar, after the flood. She comes down. Behold, O gods, I shall never forget the significance of my necklace. I shall remember these times. I shall never forget. And over here, I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall serve as a sign, right? I will remember my covenant between me and you. And these shapes are sort of the same, right? The necklace, and then the bow is presumably the rainbow, the bow. And, actually in Bereshit, this bow is referring to like a bow and arrow. And what's sort of cool is that the rainbow, right? The bow, which way is that bow pointing? The bow's aiming at God. So he's saying, if I do this again, that arrow is going to hit me. Like if you break a covenant, you suffer the punishment. Usually it's death or dismemberment. And God's saying, if I break this covenant, then I'm going to be the one to take the punishment. So anyways, that's sort of an aside. But just to say they have similar imagery, but much different, definitely different meanings. Something a bit more developed in the Hebrew story with the meaning of the bow. And there is actually now a consequence for Elohim. So anyways, just some interesting differences there. Here we have more polytheistic, monotheistic differences. These are the gods sort of arguing amongst each other after the flood. They're yelling at Elil, who caused the flood. How, oh, how could you fail to consult us? You didn't tell us. We were so surprised. This is way more than we thought it was going to be. You totally went overboard, right? Punish the sinner for his sin, punish the criminal for his crime. And again, here we have intimations that the flood was a moral punishment, because they're saying, look, you just punished everyone. Why didn't you single out certain people? And then in the Genesis story of Bereshit, there is no arguing. There's no, he is of one mind. They are in Elohim. They are in harmony. He is in harmony. So just more differences on the storytelling aspect of how the nature of God. And then you think, okay, well, whose story won? And I think that the answer is pretty obvious. Like, no one really argues for this conception of God. Like, hey, didn't you know the gods are arguing in heaven? Like, I don't think they're arguing. Like, that's not part of our conversation. For whatever reason, the Hebrew conception of God has dominated. So that story has won. And then it ends in conclusion, until now, Utnapishtim was mortal. He gets rewarded with immortality. And then in the Noach, he, be fertile and increase. So there is like a reward for this righteous man. Yeah, so there we go. So we have looked at two different examples in the Bible, right? Two different stories, and compared them to two stories that originated from a culture that preceded them, the Babylonian culture. And remember, they're both Semitic, so they both have a lot of similarities. And we've seen how both of these sets of stories share a lot of common narrative elements, except that the Hebrew stories told these elements in a totally different way. And actually, the difference between these stories is no smaller or no less than the difference between polytheism in the Babylonian culture and monotheism in the Judaic culture. So big, big differences, and yet, like the same what, right? The same things happened, but the why and the how completely changed. And so that to me shows that our idea of a storytelling contest, right? Taking the same elements, but telling them in a completely different way, it seems like that's at work here with the Bible, just like it was in Gilgamesh. And it's really amazing how you can take the same story, you can keep the same plot themes, the same narrative arc, but just switch around the why and the how. And you can come up with a completely different story with a completely different meaning, a whole different way of looking out at the world. Again, polytheism versus monotheism, absolutely radically different ways of conceiving the world. And so it really shows the power of storytelling contests or evolving manuscripts. So we're going to look at one last element, redaction. That's another thing that they use to create religious epics, at least in Babylon, and see if that's at work in the Bible. And then from there, we'll take a step back and just kind of talk about some of the implications of all this. So we are going to look at the book of Genesis, and what I'm going to show you is what looks to be the same story, but just repeated as if they pulled it from different regions or traditions, because it has the same structure, the same elements, even a lot of the same phrases, but they just put them in more or less side by side, and then it looks like they wove like a narrative around it to weave it into one big narrative, and that's very similar to what they found with Gilgamesh. So this is the idea of redaction, taking existing stories and weaving them into a single narrative. So let's take a look at that. So I've laid out this story form into a grid, and I'll show you how it repeats throughout Genesis. So the first part of the story is there's some reason the patriarch has to go off to some foreign land. In this case, it's a famine. And that does actually happen twice, but we'll get through this. He has to flee to a foreign land, and there is a powerful foreign ruler there who's more strong than him. And he gets scared, and he says to his wife, just say you're my sister so he doesn't kill me. If I'm your brother, he's not going to kill me because he's going to try to take you as his wife. So here you can see, you are my sister. Please say that it may go well with me, right? So there it is here. And then usually God intervenes saying, why are you taking this guy's wife? And he does something. Here he's afflicting the Pharaoh. Other times he just yells at him. And then the foreign ruler gets freaked out and goes, why did you tell me this? Why were you lying to me? You should have told me she was your wife, not your sister. And then the patriarch gets rich. Like, the foreign ruler gives him a bunch of stuff and says, please go away so nothing else bad happens to me. And that is the basic story format. So that was chapter 12. We're going to see it again here in Genesis 20, just a few chapters later. The same guy, Abraham. And he says to his wife, again, she is my sister. And so King Abimelech takes her. And then God comes in. What are you doing? You're going to die because of this woman. Instead of a plague, he just yells at him. And then Abimelech says, what have you done? What is this you've done, right? What have you done to us? What wrong have I done? Please get out of here. Take a bunch of stuff. Again, Abraham gets rich off of this encounter, just like he did with the Pharaoh. So there's a second version of the story. So now we go to Genesis 26, this time involving Yitzhak, his son. And there's a famine in the land, just like in Genesis 12, which by itself isn't totally uncommon, but there's a famine here, and he flees off to a stronger ruler, Abimelech, the same exact guy, even though it's a generation later. She is my sister, talking about his wife, right? This guy's going to kill me if she finds out, or if he finds out I'm your husband. I'd rather be your brother, all things being equal. And Abimelech finds out, what have you done to us, right? And then he acquired flocks and herds. So the same thing with the same exact guy a generation later. It seems like this is just a story brick, like a story Lego piece, maybe told a few different ways, maybe from different traditions. They put them together, chapters 12, 20, 26, even across generations, and then they sort of splice it together with some narratives, and maybe they adjusted them a little bit so that it fits inside one narrative. So you might be thinking, like, okay, well, maybe it happened 3 times in a row. I mean, maybe that king was really long-lived. That's why Isaac was able to go and talk to him. And he's like, well, my dad went there once. Maybe I'll try going there again. Like father, like son, I'll lie about my wife. Maybe it could have happened. Or you could be thinking, well, it's sort of just an ancient form of storytelling, which I think is probably true. I mean, it's a sacred history, right? Which is a history about focusing on the relationship between a deity and their people. And so maybe this story format, for some reason, really typifies that relationship, blah, blah, blah. It could be all those things. But let me show you this happening in a place where I never really would have thought you would have done it here, okay? You'll see what I mean. So let's get into these next 2 examples, actually. So they do this with the naming of things, which is something that I never really thought was I didn't think they would do that. So I'll show you what I mean. So again, same part of Genesis, chapter 21 here, again with Abimelech. This time it's Abimelech and Pikol, his chief. And Abraham says to him, God's with you in everything that you do. Swear to me here that you will not deal falsely with me. And they end up making this treaty, but they also make a deal regarding this well, Be'er Sheva. And he's like, it's this weird oath that they make where he gives over like 7 cows, 7 goats, and because Sheva sounds like 7, which is Shava. And he's saying, look, this well is mine, so if I give you this stuff, that's you affirming that the well is mine. And so, he named, henceforth that well was called Be'er Sheva because he made this deal of 7, which is a pun on oath. So it's the well of the oath. Be'er is well, and Sheva is oath. So here, this is just a nice story about why this well is called Be'er Sheva. But wouldn't you know it, in Genesis 26, with the son Yitzhak, I'm going to try to get used to saying the Hebrew. Yitzhak does this with the same guy, Abimelech, and his counselor, Pikol. So they're both, I guess, really long-lived. I don't know, they both are. And again, we now see plainly that God is with you, and let there be a sworn treaty between us, right? Same thing that Abimelech said before. And they make this treaty, and then later on that same day, oh my God, his servants come to him. Guess what? We dug up this well. That's amazing. Let's call it Sheba or Sheba. And then they named the city Be'er Sheva, but it's named after that well. So this well that his father had, they redug up. They renamed it the same exact name. It's just how, the modern mind goes, how can both of these be true at the same time? That's kind of crazy. Maybe they forgot. I don't know. You can't really explain it. This is just an ancient form of storytelling. And they put it almost side by side, just 5 chapters apart. So it's not like they're trying to pull one over on you. I mean, like, the readers would know this. I think it's just they wanted you to see both stories for some reason. And then, again, they wove this into a single narrative as if, I don't know, like the guy, Isaac, didn't know that this well had already been discovered. So, yeah, okay, now we're going to get to our last example. Okay, so this is another famous site / landmark called Beit El, and that's Bethel, which simply means house of God. And here we have a story about its discovery by Yaakov or Jacob. And this is the famous, how awesome is this place? God is here. I didn't even know it, this whole thing. And he named that site Beit El, Bethel. Super momentous discovery, like legendary story about Beit El. And then we just go to 7 chapters later, and here someone has, he finds it again. There he built an altar, named the site El Beitel, and it's Jacob. It's Yaakov again finding Beitel. So now we have 2 stories about the discovery of Beitel, and it's by the same person. So, kind of surreal. And then in that same chapter, someone finds it again. Look who finds it again. Jacob gave the site where God has spoken to him the name of Beit El. He names it again. So we have Beit El discovered 3 different times by the same person, really just within the same chapters. So this whole conception of factual truth, of trying to have consistency, the kind of consistency that we as modern people would think is paramount, which is, absolutely necessary, they totally have a different view, right? And the final kicker is that in Genesis 12, Avraham already went to Beit El. It was already a place, like it was already named Beit El. So yeah, 4 different appearances of Beit El in terms of like people going there for the first time, and 3 of those times the grand discovery and naming was by the same person. So I don't know if that's not redaction. I don't know what is. It just seems like they just put the same stories in on top of each other, and they're trying to create some kind of meaning out of it. So I think these last few examples really demonstrate how hard it is for us to understand a document that was written so long ago, where the authors clearly had a different conception of how to convey information, how to arrange it, and what the most important thing was to communicate, in a sense, right? Because, like, if we were to compose history as we understand it, we would try to get all those facts right. We wouldn't have 3 different versions of how a place was discovered, something so simple as just like how this place got its name. Or at least if we presented multiple versions, we would say, well, it could have been this or it could have been that. Like, we would have tried to have some explanation. We certainly would not have placed them side by side with no explanation at all and expect the reader to derive some kind of message out of that. It's just a totally different way of thinking. So you really have to be careful about how you interpret ancient writers. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, but this Jacob story is a clear example, because I think the way we interpret it is like, oh, Jacob discovered this thing 3 times. That doesn't make any sense. What I think they were trying to say is not, hey, he discovered it 3 different ways, but more like the meaning of its discovery, the meaning of Beit El, which means house of God, obviously a pretty important term, especially in a patriarchal society. The meaning of this site to us can be captured in 3 different ways, And it's only when you put all three of those different ways together can you fully understand the full meaning of this landmark. I think that's probably somewhat what they were trying to do there, not just like doing just a factual recounting of what happened. And this really brings us all the way back to the beginning of this video when I'm talking about what is revelation and why start with that question. Well, that question is the ground upon which the idea of is there a God, right? This atheist-theist debate, this is the arena in which it takes place. This is the setting of that argument, because you can't have that argument unless there's some kind of agreement upon what it means that God would exist. I mean, what is acceptable proof? And to me, that seems predicated upon, like it or not, even as modern people, upon what the ancients thought of as revelation. Because we keep reading all this stuff, right? God said this, God did that, he appears on a mountain, he raises people from the dead. We just feel like, oh, well, the ancient view of divinity must be some kind of extraordinary event, that it's only contained to that. And so if I'm not hearing this audible voice, then I'm not experiencing God. And so I've never experienced that. I don't think anyone can experience that. Therefore, God does not exist. For example, I think ultimately what this video is trying to show is that our notion of ancient divinity, I think, is a little bit skewed. I don't think the ancients thought of revelation as this narrow sliver of reality where only the extraordinary, right? That's a little bit relative, but shall we say like grand supernatural events like the earth splitting open or this giant vision in the sky or something like that, that's the only way they conceived of divinity. Because the evidence would seem to indicate that the creative process that got the Bible words onto the page involved pretty familiar processes. Evolving manuscripts, redaction, things that happen or occur over time, over long periods of time. So if it is true that the Bible came about through very human traditions, these long iterative and redactive traditions, then that would necessarily mean that their idea of divinity included that as well, that we are a part of the divine, the divine revelation, that we take part in it somehow. And if it does kind of pass the common sense test in a way, because things that last through generations, God is everlasting, God is unchanging. Truth should, in some sense, be unchanging. And that would qualify that if we continually seek out and tell these stories, and it's almost like the science of intuition. It's a collective think. And the ideas that endure, well, by definition, if God is everlasting, it's like, well, this is the word of God. It's everlasting. We've discovered something that withstands time. And so then thinking about revelation or the creation of the Bible in this way naturally sort of upends or makes the atheist-theist argument, that traditional argument, it sort of makes it a little bit topsy-turvy. It's like I'm seeing a long-standing tradition, a human tradition, that is divine. That was what the issue with Dawkins and Peterson, when they got to the head of their argument, it was like, hey, you're bringing the divine down to the mundane. And Peterson's like, no, I'm bringing the mundane up to the divine. I mean, he said it doesn't matter which one it is. But that really blurs the lines. Now the arena of where that argument takes place, what is admissible evidence, starts to become pretty blurry. And so what I'm saying is that even the ancient notion of divine, if you took an ancient person and brought him back here, or someone who, let's say, I don't know, had some part in the creation of the Bible, that tradition, the telling and the retelling and the redaction of these stories, they might say, well, yeah, of course, that tradition, that is how we channel the voice of God. And it's a cool story too, because it's like, how should the word of God be heard? Like, if it's something that's so deep and so vast and expansive and so beyond us, do you think it would just happen like, hey, oh, what was that, God? Oh, okay, now I know the secrets of the universe. Cool, okay, well, what's next? What's for lunch now? Like, it should be this thing where we have to listen and listen and listen, and no one generation is able to capture it. It has to be seen by multiple generations for, in different geographic areas, and together somehow this story emerges. And that's a really cool idea. And to me, it really makes the scriptures so much more amazing. Any of these divine ancient documents that have withstood time. I mean, the Bible's probably, I think it's the most prominent, at least in the Western, in Western thought. Yeah, it's remarkably unchanged. And anyways, just to think about it as this theory, this presentation of information that has gone through the fire. It's been battled upon. It's been modified and changed and argued about and mocked and criticized. And I mean, it has withstood any number of attempts to overthrow it and to crush it and to build it up. And each little move whittled away and chipped at it and resurrected it until it's reached kind of, I guess, a stable form now, in the Torah Tanakh, where it really hasn't changed. They just have, no one has come up with a better, a good enough reason to change it. And religions do die. That was actually a problem in the ancient world, where you're trying to come up with the right story, the right character of a god to unify people, and eventually people are like, that's stupid, and gods die and they get replaced, and for some reason this particular story, I think probably through a number of deaths and resurrections, this is the story that emerged. And to me, like, it really just levels the playing field in terms of, like, if you're, whether you're a materialist or whether you're one of these people like me who just believes in everything, you know what I mean? Like, I just always have like a mystical explanation for everything for whatever reason. But anyways, like, there's now an appeal to both sides, because look, even if you're just materialist, it is pretty interesting that this form has remained stable. Like, just like Shakespeare, it's remained stable. Like, why has this emerged through the ages? And if you're like a religious person, then you now know you are part of the tradition. It wasn't just a top-down thing. It wasn't just one special guy just listening perfectly, handing it down to the rest of us plebs, you know. We all had a hand in this tradition, and we can really now engage with this text. So then I think the proper way to engage these texts, because they were born out of fire, is to be combative with them as much as you want, to push and pull at them, to punch holes in them, to kick them a little bit, to in order to understand them, because that's what the text is doing to you. I mean, this is not like a nice, well, symmetrical, everything happens, everything ends happily, everything connects together perfectly, the world is this perfect structure that we can see. Like, it's not like that. The text is there to challenge you, to make you go, wait, what? Like, what? Why did they write that? And it contains all these amazing memes, like the Tree of Knowledge. That is a uniquely Hebraic tradition. The Tree of Knowledge does not exist in any other tradition. The Tree of Knowledge, that thing has withstood the test of time, and it still confounds people. One great question this rabbi asked was, why wouldn't you want someone to know the difference between good and evil? That seems like a pretty good thing to know. So it's like you're supposed to be doubtful, and it's supposed to move you. So just to say, like, we need everyone to be looking at these on whatever level they want to look at it with. We need scientists to look at it. We need, right, all kinds of people to engage with this, not just people who are religious and just see it from an authoritative perspective. I mean, there's a place for that in a sense, but like, we can engage with this on a human level because it was humans that created it. At least we can say humans created it. Humans took a pencil and wrote it down, or whatever, whatever it was, a stylus with a hammer. I don't know exactly how. And we just can't forget that, and they were dealing with real problems. How to keep a nation together, and through the problem of necessity, which really is reality, right? Whatever reality we get thrown into necessities. We don't choose the necessities, and we have to operate within this sphere. And that push and pull of us with reality creates a natural picture of reality. The more we're able to define what this thing is and to find a way to move through it, which is that is the work of intuition. That is the work of tradition. And that's what this thing is trying to do. Like, that was the purpose of it. So then, what is revelation? Now, you could make the argument then, based on kind of all these different ideas about redaction and these human traditions, that the most powerful form of revelation, the most powerful, like, proof of divinity or proof of transcendence, isn't these one-off miracles per se. These, I saw this apparition, or this man came out of the sky, or whatever it is, these different stories. What brought about the book, what brings about these writings, this process, is this centuries long redaction and evolving manuscript tradition. Or in other words, it's it's like it's flesh and blood. It's us arguing about it and making fun of it or respecting it, or getting into it, putting ourselves into the story. It's our humanity that somehow brings about these ideas that are transcendent, these ideas that endure and that can guide generation after generation. And I mean, that's really to me, that's the goal. That's the fruit that we're trying to get at. And you want to argue about it, is it divine or not? It's whatever. I mean, it's kind of definitional, because the Babylonians thought cow pens were divine. They thought jewelry making was divine. Like, they thought cities were. They didn't like one of the very first cities was like Venice. It had canals. Imagine being in like a leopard skin with a club, and you're dragging around this carcass that you've been chewing on for the last week, and you look up and you see these pillars, or like this giant, you wouldn't even know what to call it. It's a wall that's glowing blue from the lapis lazuli, the jeweled stone that they inlaid in it. They've carved golden lions on it. There's a swinging gate. Inside the gate is a city filled with canals, festooned with gardens, pyramid-like structures, and beautiful women in jewelry and garbs, honestly having sex. They would have sex in this square to do fertility rites. I mean, dude, you what would you call that if you were that caveman guy? So anyways, I hope this encourages you to engage, to relook at these books, and to get your hands dirty, and to not be afraid of challenging it and trying to understand what it is on its level. You know what I mean? Regardless of what, how you thought it came to be or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like it. So there you go.